start our next presentation, and we have Rabbi Josh with us today. But first, I'd like to introduce you to Laurent Girassi, who is the director of the Lux Center here at Sacred Heart Seminary School of Theology. The Lux Center is a center for Jewish-Catholic dialogue and exploration. We do a lot of things with the Jewish community here in town, and so I will introduce Laurent first, and we're happy to have him. Thank you.
Thank you, Deacon Steve. Inspired by the great presentation that Dr. Yuzhaf gave earlier, I'm going to do this part in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew. So I'm hoping you understand everything. At least not in Greek, right? What's harder? So my name is Liran Gerasi. That's the right way to pronounce my name. I was born and raised in Jerusalem, as you can probably hear from my accent. I'm the director of the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. We work on teaching or educating the seminarians here about the Jewish roots of Christianity, the Jewish roots of Catholicism. Much of our work is being done thanks to a great collaboration that we have with the local Jewish community of Milwaukee. We have, I think that the people who are here regularly can say that we have over here rabbis and leaders of the Jewish community coming here very often to teach classes and to engage and get involved with the life of the seminarians. And eat bagels with Lux. And when I say Lux, I mean the Lux Center, not the fish. We do have the fish too. Thank you. As Deacon Steve said, I think that we have a great collaboration now with the Jewish community. It gets us an opportunity to have really great speakers over teaching about Judaism, teaching about the Sabbath in Judaism, the Ten Commandments. I don't know if you know that there are differences, and other topics like the Torah. One of the great speakers that gave a great talk last year, and he's going to do it again this year, is Rabbi Josh Herman. Speaking of doctor, I was going to say Rabbi Yuzhaf. Dr. Yuzhaf talked about the word chesed, kindness, when I first came to Milwaukee, overwhelmed. Rabbi Josh was the first person to speak Hebrew to me. So it was a great act of chesed, of kindness, so thank you for that. Rabbi Josh studied in medicine. He grew up here in Milwaukee, and then studied to be a rabbi. And his first job as a rabbi was in Houston, Texas. And then he felt like it's not far enough from home. His second rabbi job was in Jerusalem, Israel. And then he came back here to lead probably the toughest job anyone could do during this last few years, to lead the Jewish students organization, not union, organization, in the campuses in Milwaukee, which was quite tough 2 years to do this job, but he did it very successfully. Great rabbi, great speaker. You're going to witness it soon. Right now, Rabbi Josh holds a very important role in the community. He's the head of the Milwaukee Jewish Day School, which means he raises generations now of new Jewish kids. He's also the head of the school that my daughters go to. So if you were wondering why I'm so nice to him and flattering him so much, I have an interest in it. So thank you for coming here. And Deacon Steve, thank you for inviting Rabbi Josh again, and Rabbi Josh Herman.
Thank you, Liran, for that beautiful introduction. Liran said it was an act of chesed that I spoke Hebrew to him. The true act of chesed was the fact that he pretended to understand what I was saying to him in Hebrew, despite my accent and broken Hebrew and such. But Liran has become a dear, dear friend. When I walked in, he said, "Who's running the school today?" And I said, "Don't worry, Lihi's on it. That's his little one who could run the school with an iron fist." She really could. So just really, really appreciate the warm introduction, and just so glad that Liran is here. I want to thank Deacon Steve as well for inviting me and also become a friend. And I just have to love the fact that after my mother, the person I know with the best Yiddish is indeed a deacon, which I didn't exactly expect, but really grateful to be here. And I'll say on a personal note, I've shared this actually last time I was here teaching. Professor Lux was here visiting, and I had a chance to meet him. And I shared this with him that growing up in Milwaukee, actually before I was born, my mother was just a low-level secretary at the local office of the Anti-Defamation League, which at that point had an office in Milwaukee. She was a young girl right out of school, and Professor Lux was on the board. And she said most of the board members would, walk in and walk past this, kid sitting at the desk doing paperwork or whatever, but he would always stop. He knew her name. He asked her how she was, took an interest in her life, and she just remembered him as this incredible mensch. And it was just a real honor. And I grew up hearing that story and got to meet him and now become involved in the Lux Center. It's a real great honor, and just shows that it's an incredible institution, really a jewel of our community, and named after just an incredible human being. So just a true delight and honor to be here. With that, I will just give a brief overview of what I'm going to sort of talk about. And as all good sermons do, I'm going to begin with an apology, which is I'll be going through a lot of texts, and I should have made a handout, but they'll be on the screen. And maybe the first 2 rows will be able to see them. But I'll read out loud. I'll try to go slowly so that we can do it together. And then afterwards, I'm happy to share with Deacon Steve and Liran the PowerPoint so that you can access the texts directly. But really, what I was asked to talk about is how to mine the Hebrew Scriptures for a message. So what I want to do is just go through some broad strokes in general about what sort of the Jewish exegetical tradition looks like, at least in my view, and then focus on sort of one aspect of it, and then going through the 3 Old Testament or Hebrew Scripture texts that Deacon Steve had sent me that's sort of relevant for the Sundays of Lent, use each of those texts, and we'll see based on time if we get through all 3, if we get through 1 or 2, it's fine, and sort of see how this particular aspect of the Jewish exegetical tradition, an example of how that might be used to extract some additional meaning from that text. We'll save plenty of time at the end for questions, but also if I use a term you don't understand, or if you have any question, please feel free to stop me at any time, and if I'm running long, then Deacon Steve will presumably throw something at me, and that's right, give me the hook. Okay, terrific. So the word lectionary means nothing to most Jews, but we do have a lectionary. But as of all things, there's never one simple answer. So the traditional history of this, of where scriptural readings come in terms of a public reading of Torah or of Scripture, actually have sort of 2 bases, as do all sort of liturgical things in Judaism. They developed more or less simultaneously, less more than more, but more or less, in the 2 centers of sort of late ancient Judaism, which were in the land of Israel and in Babylonia. And interestingly enough, despite the fact that the land of Israel is very much the spiritual homeland of the Jewish people, liturgically speaking, much of our liturgy, including our lectionary, actually is much more deeply based on the Babylonian tradition. Much of the Eretz Israeli, the land of Israel tradition, was sort of lost among the centuries as Jews were exiled and Babylonia became more of a large center of Jewish learning. And if we focus on the most significant part of the lectionary, there was a vast difference between these 2 centers of Judaism. As with most things, in the land of Israel, the pace was sort of very laid back. You have the Torah, right, the 5 books of Moses, and it would be read weekly in the synagogue, and each congregation would would start reading, and wherever they sort of finished off that particular Sabbath, the next Sabbath they'd pick up again. And so everyone was reading the Torah at their own pace, at their own cycle. Some would read longer passages, some shorter passages. There was sort of no unity to this. Whereas in Babylonia, it became quite codified quite early that there were disparate passages for each Sabbath, so that any congregation you walked into would be reading the same passage. Certain differentiations that over time became more or more unified. Of course, depending on the year, there may be more Sabbaths or fewer Sabbaths, so some of the portions would be combined on, let's say, a leap year in which there's an additional Hebrew month, so there's 4 or 5 extra weekly readings. Those would then be separated in order to have more. And today, that's largely what we follow in Judaism, is the Babylonian tradition. So the word in Hebrew is a parsha, right, a portion, and each Sabbath you walk into a synagogue, and for the most part, any synagogue you walk into is going to be reading the same parsha. This week the parsha is Shmot. It's the first passage in the book of Exodus. They do not line up to the chapter and verses that were developed by the church. Jews do use those just to reference text because it's much easier, but a parsha might begin in the middle of a chapter, as we know it. Just so happens is the first of the book of Exodus, and so it begins with chapter 1, verse 1. It works out very nicely that way. But that's essentially the lectionary. And the reason I bring this up is it really focuses on the weekly Torah portion. So if we understand the Hebrew Bible as being the Tanakh, right, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, right, this is focused on that first part of it, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which are broken up into these weekly portions that are linear. And after 1 year, you've completed, right, you've started Genesis 1, and you've completed the end of Deuteronomy, and then this happens in the fall, right after the festival of Sukkot. We have the festival of Simchat Torah, the joy of the Torah, in which everybody finishes the annual Torah reading and begins again. It's a tradition that you do it almost in one breath, that there's sort of no break in the repetition of reading of Torah. Just as you finish Deuteronomy, you begin once again. And so we read publicly every word of Torah, right? If you're a synagogue-going Jew, you go every Shabbat, every Sabbath, you're going to hear the entire Torah word for word. The prophets, not so, although you will hear large selections. It eventually became codified that the ancient rabbis would identify a passage from the prophets that would thematically connect to something in that week's Torah portion. And this is not linear at all. You might read a passage from Isaiah 12 one week, and then you're reading something from Amos the next week, right? There's no linear notion. It's all thematic. So if the Torah portion is talking about the building of the tabernacle, the Haftarah will likely be something describing the building of the temple in Jerusalem, for example, a thematic connection. And then for the writings, you have even fewer examples of public liturgical reading. The really only time that a large chunk of text from the writings is ever read are what are called the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls, each of which is connected to a festival. So for example, on Sukkot, you'll read the entire scroll of Ecclesiastes, right? On Tisha B'Av, the day which mourns the destruction of the temple, you'll read all of Lamentations. But aside from that, there's never, for example, a liturgical reading of Job. Right? Passages from Job are sprinkled throughout the liturgy, but the only time you'll really encounter Job as a full text is in the study hall, right? You'll never actually do it sort of in the synagogue. And the result is you'll sort of see, even though all of these are considered sacred writings, you're going to see a lot more exegetical material on Torah than you will on the prophets, although you'll still see a lot in the prophets, and you'll see a lot less in the writings than you will on the prophets. That being said, it exists on all of these, and one of the things that you'll see very shortly is that all of these texts are going to be read in light of one another, right? There's a very sort of a major focus on intertextual readings in which you'll be reading a passage from Leviticus, but you're going to actually bring in a passage from Daniel to better understand that. And the rabbis in these commentaries love to play with these things. It almost becomes a game. How can I offer a commentary on this week's Torah portion, starting with a verse that seems as far thematically, linguistically, chronologically as possible, and then loop it to another verse, to another verse, to another verse, to get to our verse in question. They didn't have many other hobbies, apparently, I don't know. So I always describe the Jewish exegetical tradition using the name of this work by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's one of the sort of preeminent Jewish theologians of the 20th century. He's incredibly prolific, many incredibly beautiful and important works. One of them, one of his few works that he actually wrote in Hebrew, this is the English translation, is the Heavenly Torah as refracted through the generations. Torah min hashamayim ba'aspaklaria shel hadorot, which I always think is a beautiful turn of phrase because it really does describe how this works. I'll sometimes speak to my students, or when I was teaching in a seminary, would focus this a lot, that a Jewish reading of text is rarely, I sit down and have a one-on-one encounter with the biblical text. Okay, here's our text from this week's Torah portion. I'm going to read it and I'm going to decide what it means. Right? Instead, I'm going to view sort of the text through this prism of generations of commentary. So if the light coming in one side of the prism is the fixed text of the Torah, let's say, the prism is Jewish tradition, and here we have an incredible array or spectrum of understandings and interpretations. And you can see this graphically. It's not limited to just the written Torah, but also what we call the oral Torah, the rabbinic writings, and the traditional Vilna Shas printing of the Talmud. This is the first page of the first tractate of the Talmud. And as you can see, the Talmud text is just here in the center, and surrounding it are various commentaries from across the centuries, going all the way from antiquity into about the 16th century or so. And so it's traditional that when yeshiva students, when seminary students learn to read Talmud, they always say you have two fingers, because you always have one finger on the text and one finger on Rashi's commentary, a medieval French rabbi who's the most authoritative commentator, right? You don't encounter the text directly, you encounter the text through these commentaries. All traditions have some kind of a history of reception, as I think the scholarly term is typically used, and in Judaism it's just all the more so, and sometimes these interpretations are very creative, up to, I would even argue, the point where they sometimes fully contradict what we might think is the simple meaning of the text. One of the mnemonics that's sometimes used to describe this is this word pardes. You can see the Hebrew letters here. Pardes, the word, anyone practicing the Hebrew know what the word pardes means? It comes from a Greek word, apropos our last talk. Pardes comes from the same word that we get paradise, right, but actually means an orchard, in modern Hebrew at least, and in ancient Hebrew. And you ever walk through an orange orchard and feel the smell, you feel a little taste of paradise. Pardes is the mnemonic to think of 4 levels of interpretation that we might have of a sacred text. The P or Pe stands for the pshat, which is the simple or literal meaning of the text. So that's what I say when you take your Bible, you open it up, you read the verse, and you say, this is what it means, right? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I can tell you what it means. It means that time started here, God is the one that created, God created the heaven and earth, that's the simple meaning. Remez, the R or the Resh, literally means a hint, and it means more of a symbolic meaning, okay? Do we actually mean that historically speaking God created this, or is there some kind of metaphorical, deeper meaning that we ought to take from that, whether it precludes or doesn't preclude the simple meaning, right? Sometimes this is an additional layer, sometimes one of my teachers used to joke, the pshat, it seems so simple, this literal meaning, but what is the literal meaning of that you should circumcise the foreskin of your heart, right? There actually is no literal meaning, right? I mean, unless you have a problematic anatomy, this is not a literal thing, right? It means to remove the excess, right? The third, where we're going to focus our time, is the D or Dalid is for drash, which I didn't translate here because I'm going to translate about 15 different ways on the next slide. And what we won't get into, because I am no mystic, is the last one is the sod, which is, sod literally means secret, is a mystical understanding. I do not come from a mystical tradition whatsoever. I get a little confused and overwhelmed by it. I don't know, I'm too westernized maybe, I don't know. But we won't get into that part of it. But that you're going to encounter in Jewish texts like the Kabbalah, for example, are going to have a more mystical understanding of these texts, focusing on some of those texts that really lead themselves to Ezekiel's chariot is a classic example of this. But we're going to focus on the D, on the drash. Before I get there, any questions about what I've covered so far? I'm used to a K through 8 school, so let me say you guys are fantastically well behaved. This is a delight. So the D is for drash. Daled Resh Shin is the linguistic root of the word midrash. Midrash is the nominal form, and midrash is a very, very challenging word to translate. But this is really the core of Jewish exegesis. Lidrosh, the verb form, right, can mean to demand. Ani doresh mimcha mashu. I demand that you give me something, right? So you can demand the text of a certain meaning. It can mean to search. It can mean to inquire, to expound, to study, and there's probably other words that I could place here. It has an incredibly wide semantic range. And the usages of the word are also quite wide, including sometimes where it's not used terribly accurately. So one is, and where we're going to focus a lot, is as a method of exegesis, a way of approaching text and deriving meaning from the text, which is a very specific and very complex method of doing so. It can refer to a particular work, an actual book on the shelf. Bereshit Rabbah is a midrash. It is a midrash. It is a commentary on the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, right? So it can refer to an individual work, which is usually, but not always, a line-by-line commentary. So here's a commentary on verse 1 of Genesis 1, on verse 2 of Genesis 1, and so on and so forth. Sometimes less linear, sometimes it's on the first verse of every weekly Torah portion, for example, but more or less linear. Sometimes it refers to a specific text. I know a midrash on that verse, meaning I know a commentary, I know a story about, I know an elaboration of that work. So it can either mean the whole work itself or one sort of individual paragraph within that work. Or colloquially, it can mean sort of any interpretation or extra textual story or tradition. So sometimes if I make up a story that's going to sort of mimic some kind of story in the Bible, I'll call that a midrash. It's not a terribly well example because it doesn't fit a more narrow definition, but you'll hear people do that, or you'll even see, if you Google midrash, you'll see people have written modern midrashim, right, which are not really a thing. What they mean is modern commentaries, but they typically don't use the rigid rules or structures of the traditional midrash. But now that I've thoroughly confused you on what midrash means, because it means all of these things, I want to give an example from the Talmud that kind of illustrates this kind of approach to text in a few different ways. So again, my apologies on how small the text is, but I'll do my best to read slowly. So this comes from a tractate called Menachot on page 29b. The Talmud always brings things in the name of whatever rabbinic sage taught this. This is one of the most famous stories from the Talmud. It says, Rabbi Yehuda says that Rav says, so Rabbi Yehuda is quoting his teacher Rav, when Moses ascended on high, so Moses is going up to Mount Sinai, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. So this is a text of the Torah. Apparently, I was told that you guys are going to see an actual Torah scroll at some point, which is lovely. And when you do, you'll see that there's little, and you might not be able to see from here, little decorations above each letter, right? It's different scribal traditions. They look a little bit different, but there's all these little decorations on tops of the letters. And Moses sees God tying those little crowns and decorations onto the letters of the Torah. Moses said before God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? God, what are you doing? Why are you decorating every little letter of this text? Just write the thing, right? So the people are waiting. It's been 40 days and 40 nights, right? What are you doing? And God said to him, so God says to Moses, there is a man who is destined to be born after several generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name, right? Akiva, who lives in the 1st century of the Common Era, right? So there's going to be a guy named Akiva. This is what God answers him. And he is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds and mounds of halachot, mounds and mounds of laws, of rules, of interpretations. In other words, God says to Moses that it's not that you're just going to interpret, right, this verse. It's not that you're going to interpret this word. It's not that you're going to interpret this letter. On every little thorn and thistle upon the letter, every piece of calligraphy, every stroke of the pen, there is an infinite amount that you can learn. that is what the Torah. And then the story goes on, by the way, in a beautiful way, that Moses turns around and is magically transported in time to Rabbi Akiva's classroom, some 1,300 years later, and can't understand a word of what's going on. And he doesn't understand it. He doesn't get it. And then one of the students asks Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? And he says, it's Torah l'Moshe Sinai. It is Torah that was taught to Moses at Sinai. And then he understood that even though he can't understand it, there's an unbroken tradition from what they're learning in that classroom to what he received from God on Mount Sinai so much earlier. So it's a beautiful story which indicates that this is not simply sitting with the text and saying, here's a text, it has a simple meaning, it has one unified simple meaning, and my job as a preacher, right, is to tell you this is the meaning of the text. In contradiction to that, it's actually saying that for every single piece of Scripture, not just every verse or word or letter, but sometimes the way that they're laid out on the page, there's an infinite amount that we might be able to learn and we might be able to teach about that. So what are the characteristics of this approach? There are many, but here's the three that I've chosen to focus on that we might play with in the examples that I'm going to provide. One is that it is intertextual. So you're always going to be reading, you're often going to be reading, I should say, these verses in light of other verses. So the scripture becomes almost this accordion which can be contracted and expanded, and time can be played with, and all of a sudden Moses is going to be in conversation with Akiva, right, who lived at a different period of time, right? All of this is sort of flexible. All of this is able to be manipulated and played with between the texts. So when I said, there's no liturgical reading of these writings, where do you often encounter them? I'm studying the weekly Torah portion, and all of a sudden I'm getting an instruction about the book of Job, because in order to understand this midrash on, the weekly Torah portion, the rabbis are referencing, some verse in Job, and now I'm all of a sudden learning about that as well. Another thing is that the Midrash is often going to address a textual challenge, right? It could be a redundancy in the text, or some kind of awkward phrasing or something like this. The Harvard scholar James Kugel coined a great term called omnisignificance, right? If everything has a significance in the text, then there can't be just a repetition of a word that is not 100% necessary. There's got to be a reason, and we're going to expound a reason on why that word is repeated, right? So if the word is used, an example in the Song of Songs, it says, God's right hand slays the foe, God's right hand is powerful. Well, all of a sudden they're going to learn that actually God has two right hands, right? That's what the rabbis are going to teach, right? Unlike humans that have a right hand and a left hand, all of God's hands are dominant, right? That's the idea. There's no, it's not just for poetic license that it's repeating. We've got to be able to learn something from it. Just sort of a rhetorical phrase that you'll often hear that I use a lot as well is there's no superfluous word in the Torah. So if I'm teaching a text and I say this, I'm going to say there's no superfluous word in the Torah. Our rabbis teach that. So we're going to ask the question, why is God's right hand repeated twice here? And what can we learn from that? And that's just a rhetorical way that when I'm giving a sermon, I'll often bring in one of these midrashim to understand that we're playing with the text here. We're playing with the fact that this word is repeated, and thus we need to find an additional meaning. Just another example, I'm helping a friend's daughter with her bat mitzvah preparations for this coming Shabbat, and there's a verse in which there's just a very strange repetition of a pronominal suffix, and the rabbis expand and have a whole interpretation of this. It's just a grammatical oddity in the text. It doesn't have any necessary meaning on a simplistic level, but the rabbis are going to say, there's a weird reading in the text. This hits my ear a little bit wrong, but it can't be because that God made a mistake writing this text, right? It's not a scribal error. There's got to be something that we can learn from that repetition. And finally, it really offers a very, very close reading of text. This can be challenging in a preaching setting sometimes. It's sometimes a little bit easier in terms of a text study, but you're going to be able to focus very, very deeply on just a small portion of text because you're doing a really, really close reading. When I used to teach a weekly Torah portion class, I would joke, and some of the students loved it and some of them hated it, said, guys, I hate to break it to you, not only we're going to not get past the first chapter of this week's Torah portion, nor the first verse, we're actually not going to get past the first word. We're going to spend this hour studying one word because we're going to ago and how the rabbis played with that word. And, one person cheered and 20 people groaned, but that's what we did. So we have these three texts. As much as we have time, we can go through them. I'll bring a midrash connected to each of them. Now, only one of them is from the Torah, so the other midrashim, although there are midrashim on the books of prophets and writings, they're fewer and they tend to be later. And so I'll actually bring midrashim that are on the Torah text, but reference these texts from the prophets. I think we just have prophetic texts. We have any writings as well. But we're going to start with the first of the three texts, which comes from Exodus 17. Again, for those who are not in the first row, I'll read out loud. But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Moses cried out to Adonai, saying, "What shall I do with this people? Before long they will be stoning me." Then Adonai said to Moses, "Pass before the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarrel, and because they tried Adonai, saying, "Is Adonai present among us or not?" Okay, this is one of the what I call the kvetching narratives of the wilderness, right? The people complaining to Moses. From Exodus 17. This, by the way, is the JPS. All the translations of biblical text here are the JPS translation. And so the questions, and this slide will repeat a few times, that I want us to visit is, we're going to see a midrash on this one of these verses, and it's going to ask the question, what is the textual issue or problem or challenge that the midrash is addressing? How does it address that challenge? And then what meaning can we glean from this solution? And here is where it's helpful in a preaching context, which is the fact that if you don't have anything jumping out to you from that particular verse, it might be that something on this midrash is going to jump out at you, and now you have an additional text to teach and to provide meaning from. And that text is going to connect back to the liturgical text that we're reading from, the scriptural reading, because it's a commentary on it. So an additional layer of ability to create meaning. So what's the issue? How's the issue solved? And what's the great meaning? So here's a passage from a work called Midrash Tanchuma, which is a midrash on most of, but not all of, the book of Exodus, from the weekly portion called B'Shalach, which is the portion that this text comes from. So again, we're going to ask the question, what's the textual issue that it's solving? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, "What shall I do unto this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Right? That is the verse from our text, right? That they're going to stone me. Moses cried to the Holy One, blessed be he, "Master of the world, I shall be slain, for I am trapped between you and them. You commanded me not to be angry at them when you said to me, 'Carry them in thy bosom,'" from Numbers 11:12, right? In intertextual reading. Whoa, 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 God. You're telling me that I'm supposed to not to be angry at them before, right? In Numbers, before, by the way, it's after, right? There's no before and after here. Time is totally fungible. The rabbis even say, "Ein lifnei v'achrei b'Torah." There's no before and after in the Torah, right? Time is not linear. It's like this. You said to me, "Carry them in thy bosom." But now they wish to stone me. In this instance, the Holy One, blessed be he, had suppressed his anger while Moses increased his. Okay? So God was in a forgiving mood in the people, and Moses was all fired up and angry at the people. But elsewhere, the Holy One, blessed be he, increased his anger while Moses suppressed his, as is said, "Now therefore let me alone, that my anger may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them." And Moses besought the Lord. From Exodus 32, right? This is following the golden calf. So wait a minute, we've got a reversal of roles here. Usually, right, in the golden calf, it's Moses saying, "These people, they broke your laws, get rid of them," right? And try to convince God to do that. And here, God is sort of saying, hey, let's not, God was about to get rid of them. Moses prayed on their behalf to forgive them at the golden calf. And here, God is telling Moses to meet what they need, and Moses is saying, "Are you kidding me, God? They're trying to stone me here." It continues. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, "You said they are almost ready to stone me. Now pass on before the people, and let me see who will stone you." Take a walk and see what happens. Moses began to walk before them, and all the Israelites arose and treated him with honor and deference. The Holy One, blessed be he, declared, "Many times I commanded you not to lose patience with them, but to lead them as a shepherd does his flock. It was for their sake, the people's sake, that I elevated you, Moses, and it was because of them that you found grace, life, and honor in my sight." Okay, that's the Midrash. What's the textual problem that it's addressing? We can go back to the original text. Anyone want to take a stab at it? Thirst? Say more. Not trusting God. Let me ask you this. One of your parishioners says, hey, there's an angry mob out here that is trying to kill me, and your initial response to them is, go take a walk in front of them. It seems insensitive, it seems wrong, it seems like there's something missing here, right? That's your answer, God? It's filling in gaps in the text, right? It's giving some flourishing to the thing. That what God is actually saying here is, this isn't God being insensitive to Moses' fear about the people. What God is saying is, Moses, you are fundamentally misunderstanding what your relationship with the people is, right? And how they feel about it. Yeah, they're complaining. Yeah, they're fetching. They're not actually going to stone you. That actually, this is an opportunity for leadership. So it fixes it by adding this story in, right? It invents an entire conversation that is not in the text, right, between Moses and God, right, by filling in this gap of what's going on here, right? The Torah text itself is quite terse. This is going to elaborate, and actually it provides some meaning, which is a lesson in leadership, which is, as leaders, and those of you who lead congregations might know this, it is quite boring to lead a congregation full of perfect angels who have never done anything wrong, who agree with every word that you say, who, right, have no complexity in their lives. No, true leadership is actually sometimes getting in front of a congregation and saying something that they don't want to hear, right? Or getting up, even if they're angry or upset what's going on, and trusting that you have the kind of a relationship with them that, when you give the sermon that might challenge their assumptions or force them to look at their behavior or their thinking in a different way, that they're not going to stone you, but rather that they're going to actually trust in you as their pastor, right? And revisit this, and that Moses is the same way, and that Moses is also filled with this doubt, right? That, they're going to stone me is in some ways going on in Moses' head. It's not necessarily connected to reality. And that what God is saying when he says, walk before them, is that really, Moses, this is your test as a leader, right? The people are angry. It's easy to lead people that don't need any help. These people need help. This is your role as a leader. Okay. Moving on. Any questions about that before we move on to the next? Terrific. A next text from the 1 Samuel. We're getting to the selection of David. And here's the verse from Samuel in question. So they sent and brought him, David, right? Choosing among all of Jesse's sons, which one's going to be anointed as king, right? He was ruddy-cheeked, vihu admoni, right? Bright-eyed and handsome. And God said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. Okay? God has chosen David, and this is the description of David. Ruddy. Before we get into this, those who can read it probably give it away. Does anyone have an association from the Bible with the word ruddy? Admoni. If this were a room of rabbis, everyone's hand would shoot up and say, who is described as Admoni in the Bible? Esau. This is not a very typical term, right? You do not see this word admoni, ruddy, very frequently. And so when you do, and it's in a very well-known text, your thought is going to go to Esav, to Esau, who is also described as ruddy. Esau, not beloved by the rabbinic tradition. So now we have something interesting, that this rare word is being used to describe God's anointed king and that guy who we view as the ancestor to all of our worst enemies, right? Ruddy, Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana said, this is from Bereshit Rabbah, this is a Byzantine midrash on the book of Genesis. As though he was a shedder of blood, right? When Samuel saw that David was ruddy, as it is written, he sent and brought him, and he was ruddy, from our verse. He was afraid and said, this is a shedder of blood like Esau. Not only making the connection between ruddy and Esau, but also red, right? Admoni, ruddy, coming from the word Adom, red, right? That this is like red of blood, that this is a violent person. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, with beautiful eyes. It doesn't just say that he's ruddy, he also has beautiful eyes. Esau killed at his own initiative, but this one kills at the initiative of the Sanhedrin, right, of the rabbinic court. Okay? So what is the textual issue or problem that is being solved here? Back in the day, I used to wait until someone would give up. Yeah?
That whether or not he's trustworthy because he's a killer or he's
Right, yeah. That the first word you use to describe this guy has this negative connotation to it. Ruddy, like Esau, violent, vicious, vindictive, and so on and so forth. Like, this is the word that you're going to choose. It hits our ear strangely. Why might this be? And how do the rabbis fix this textual issue?
Beautiful eyes?
Sure. It's the beautiful eyes. He's not just ruddy, but Esau is not described as having beautiful eyes, right? So what does it mean to be ruddy? We're not denying that connection. David is a violent character, right? David is not allowed to build the temple because he has too much blood on his hands from all the wars that he has waged for Israel. He is a violent person, much like Esau. But unlike Esau, whose violence is channeled in rage and vindictiveness and so on and so forth, David's violence is channeled through justice, right? David is executing what God wants of him. David is taking down Goliath. David is fighting the Philistines, and so on and so forth. So yes, it's violent, but it's violence in the right way, right? He's not murderous. He's simply a soldier. And we know this because he also has these beautiful eyes, probably connected to the notion of seeing, right? He's not blindly killing people, right? He's doing this with some sort of vision of what is the greater good, what does God want of him. So we've solved the issue by acknowledging the textual connection, but showing that there's this added difference. Yes?
This makes sense in light of what you said earlier about there is no before and after, because this all happens before David because of all that he did.
Indeed.
But in the Midrash, it's all part of the fact that time is not linear.
Absolutely. It's a linguistic connection, right? Not a temporal one. And so the minute you hear that word admoni, ruddy, right, you know that that's, I mean, I haven't done a concordance search, but I would bet, my last dollar that, the word admoni doesn't appear in the Tanakh more than, 4 or 5 times. It might only be these 2 times. And so immediately you're going to go make that connection linguistically. And so it doesn't matter that David and Esau never met. The question is, why are you going to describe this character who's a predominantly negative association with the same word as this one, who's predominantly positive association? Very good. And what's the meaning that we can derive from this? The additional meaning. Say it again? Don't judge by appearance, right? Which is, by the way, a theme of this chapter in general, right? They immediately go to the tallest, most, strong-looking brother, and God actually says, whoa, don't judge your next leader by height, right? That is not going to be, the thing. In fact, they, as a continuing theme in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's actually the youngest and the smallest is going to be the one that's chosen. So don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge by appearance in some way. Yeah? Anything else? Mm-hmm.
So it says he did things under the initiative of the Sanhedrin.
Mm-hmm.
Was he consulting? So before he did anything, was he consulting Before he killed somebody, he was consulting a group
of elders or something like this. Right. And yeah, we don't actually have, stories of David actually doing this or whatever. I think the understanding was the Sanhedrin here, I think, and again, this is my interpretation, is a stand-in for some sort of system of justice, right? He was killing as an instrument of creating justice, right? We don't think of somebody who kills another soldier in battle the same way we do as somebody who kills somebody because they want to take their car for them or because they have a disagreement or a hatred of that person, right? In general, I think it's an acknowledgement of this thing that violence is bad and problematic, but not all violence is the same. Right? And David is this character where the rabbis play a tremendous amount with this challenge of, there's actually a beautiful, I almost brought it, a poem by a modern Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, who plays with this idea of David being, how is it that David can both be the sweet singer of psalms, who is the lover of women, who is so gentle with his lover, and meanwhile can rip the head off of a giant after, taking him down in battle, right? He is both the sort of most soft, sensuous, gentle character and such a violent character. And they're making the case here, to David's credit, that the violence was for good reason. Again, many ways that you could take this in a sermon, but asking these questions, and in my own work, this is one that we ask a lot, right? How do you make the war in Gaza, which was what every sermon has been about for a while because it's at the top of the minds of every Jewish community, right? What does it mean to wage a just war? What does it mean to wage a just war justly? These are really challenging things. Nobody wants violence, but if you have to defend yourself, sometimes that might require violence. What does our tradition teach us about that? What does our tradition teach us about not meeting our duty to do that? What does it teach us about overdoing it, right? These are all legitimate questions. It's not that there's a one-to-one correspondence between this text and we should support this particular policy of the American or Israeli government or military strategy or anything like that. But the values and themes are present in the Bible, and how can we understand spiritually and morally what's going on in the world around us? This is a tool to reflect on that. All right, we've got one more, and then I'll have a few minutes for questions. So our final text comes from the book of Ezekiel. So our verse, and I'm just going to jump straight to the verse that it's going to make us think of, so I don't have to tease you with this one, right? I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. Then you shall know that I, God, have spoken and have acted, declares God. That's the verse from Ezekiel. And what's the image that's going to conjure in the minds of the rabbi, the intertextual connection? Genesis, and what character? Adam, right? God, I formed the human, right, from the soils, I don't know how to say it. It looks like hummus to me, but I don't think they're talking about chickpea dip here. This is a weird JPS translation because they're trying to avoid the repetition of Adam and Adamah. Adam is Adam and Adamah is earth, right? Because the word for human comes from the word for earth, right? So they're trying to avoid that repetition in the English, right? So God formed the human from the dust of the earth is probably a better translation. Blowing into his nostrils the breath of life, the human became a living being. Okay, so here we have two different examples of God transforming something dead into something living. Another example from Bereshit Rabbah, that same work of Midrash that we looked at last time. And breathed into his nostrils. So we're immediately going into the Genesis text here, because that's what the focus of this Midrash is. It's commenting on that text, right? This teaches that he, God, stood up his lifeless mass, referring to Adam, so stood up Adam's lifeless mass from the earth to the heavens, and there injected a soul into it. In this world, it is injected, right? The spirit is injected into man by blowing, and that is why he dies, right? A breath is not infinite. It ends at some point, right? But in the future, it will be injected by direct placement. As it is stated, I will place my spirit in you, and you will live. So what's the textual issue? Go into our questions. How do you explain death as a thematic issue? It's not a textual issue, necessarily. This is going to be why one of the challenges, by the way, will be knowledge of Hebrew is really helpful for the study of Midrash because of those close readings, right? V'natati ruchi bachem, and I put my breath into you, right? Vayifach ba'apav nishmat chaim, and God breathed life into him. Why is it that God is twice doing the same action, right? Making something lifeless alive, but two different verbs are being used, right? It cannot just be that God chose different words to use, or the prophet Ezekiel chose different words, or they're taking poetic license. There is a reason. Otherwise, it would be word for word, dot for dot, punctuation mark for punctuation mark, identical. There's got to be a reason that these are used differently. And the reading that the rabbis give that is to say that the giving of life in this world is different than reviving the dead. That giving of life in this world is a temporary thing. When God breathes life into us, when we are given the gift of life, we know that that gift is finite. On the other hand, the resurrection of the dead is something permanent. That is life eternal, right? There's a difference here, and that's why a different verb is being used, right? You could look over this. A simple reading of this text looks over this. Okay, here he breathed. That's a beautiful sort of poetic, wording or whatever. Here he placed. It's a different word. What does it matter? Everything matters. Everything has the potential to derive meaning from, and so you might not think to use this text, maybe you would because it's not a crazy leap here, you might not use this text in order to ask this question, what is the difference between life in this world and life in the world to come? But the rabbis are going to bring you there, and now that's the topic for your sermon, right, is to ask the question of, what does it mean to appreciate the finite nature of life as opposed to the eternity of death, or something like this. So these are three examples. There are literally thousands and thousands more. And so just to offer you some resources, if this is a line of inquiry that you ever want to use, how you might go about it. First of all, a great tool is this classic work, originally published, I think, in the 1930s, but it's updated every 10 to 20 years or so. I believe 2004 is the most recent edition. It's the Introduction to the Talmud and Midrash by Strack and Stemberger. This is the classic text that goes through all the major works of Midrash and gives you some background. When it was written, what is the context? It breaks them down based on genre, some focused on legalistic interpretations, some on more homiletical interpretations, so on and so forth, so you can get a general idea of what's going on in the world and what's going on textually in some of these works that you might experience. If you're not familiar with Sefaria, the website, sefaria.org, this is an unbelievable resource for anything having to do with the Hebrew Scriptures or really Jewish text in general. It's open access, it's totally free. I think there's a premium version you can pay for some extra things, but it has all the classic Jewish texts available, many, if not most of them, in English translation, sometimes with many different English translations, so you can reach them. It's all searchable, hyperlink, and so on and so forth. So if you're looking at a text from the Old Testament, go and punch in that chapter and verse into Sefaria, and on the side you'll have links to medieval Jewish commentaries on that text, many of which will be translated into English, and there'll be a tab for Midrashim, and you can go and find a Midrash on that as well, and you can click on that and see a Midrash. Yes? Sure. Sure, Sefaria is S-E-F-A-R-I-A, and I believe it's sefaria.org, if I'm not mistaken. There's a Hebrew language version as well, but you'll access the English. And then the last resource, that's me. But in all seriousness, if you happen to live in a community in which there is, a Jewish community there, this is a great opportunity for study, and reach out to. Literally, you can reach out to me anytime. Deacon Steve and Liran have my contact information, but reach out to a local rabbinic colleague, or if there's a university that has a Jewish Studies department or a Hebrew Scriptures department, reach out to them and say, hey, I'm looking at this text, but I want to bring a different angle. Can you connect me to any of these resources or study with me or something like that? And it's a great joy to get that kind of call. As a congregational rabbi, when I would get a call like that, it's fun. You get to study in a different context. You get to learn with a new person. I would get to derive a new meaning from a text that I didn't think I would get to. So, use your human resources around you as well. That's my brief introduction to all of these things, or not so brief as it may be, but happy you've got a few minutes left if we want to ask any questions. Sorry, got a microphone coming.
So the midrashes are different schools of theology or thought. Are you allowed to mix them, or do you pretty much stay with one school and you say that's the only midrash I'm going to use for the year?
Not only can you can't avoid mixing them. So a midrash, if we're talking about a text, right, it presumably was edited by somebody, but they're all multivocal. They're all polyvocal, right? So they're going to reference different rabbis giving different interpretations, and very often you'll say, okay, for Genesis 1:1, there's an interpretation, and then it'll say Devar Acher, another word, and someone will say, you're full of it. Actually, this is the interpretation, right? And you're going to have 5 or 6 and often completely contradict each other, right? And you can either use those to put them against each other and show the inherent paradoxes here, which sometimes the answer is, there's the old joke about the couple that goes to the rabbi's office and they're having a marital disagreement and he lays out his case and the rabbi says, you're right. And the wife lays out her part of it and he says, you're right. And then the secretary says, Rabbi, they can't both be right. And he says, you're right too. Sometimes that's the answer for the midrash, right? You're all right. We have to live with these sort of competing truths. We have to live with this paradox, whatever. Or sometimes you say, I agree with this voice, but they're all polyvocal. That's part of built in the tradition, is this notion of there is no one correct interpretation. So we're going to offer many, many different interpretations. So that's true within one midrash, and that's going to be true sort of throughout all of the midrashim, if that makes sense.
I have a question over here, Rabbi, Father Mark. In the New Testament, Jesus spoke in what we call parables. And he said, I speak in parables because a lot of people, the common person does not understand what I am saying overall. So the midrash, are there different levels of midrash as far as an academic level? Were they written mainly to speak amongst the rabbis and the scholarly people, or were they meant to cover various levels of understanding and interpretation?
It's a great question. I would argue the former, that it really was written by rabbis and scholars for rabbis and scholars. In general, rabbinic literature is very challenging literature, right? It is not written for the common people. This was for a very closed circle of scholars. I mean, the brilliance of this work, that, they often didn't have all of these written texts in front of them. They just knew these texts so well that this word reminds them of that word from a completely different book, because all of this is just sort of swimming in their head. Sort of a common reader wouldn't have that. I mean, today we have hyperlinks, right? Like when I'm on Safari, I can click it. Those links were happening within their own brains, and so it's very, very challenging. That being said, one of the roles I always would teach my students when I was teaching the seminary of the rabbi is to make this very inaccessible stuff accessible, right? That if Jesus speaks in parables, right, I presume that part of the job of the preacher is to say, I'm going to lay out this parable for you. I'm going to help you understand the parable. And similarly with this, right? I'm going to help you understand the text. I'm going to also help you understand the way that the rabbis understood the text, and that will just add deeper levels of meaning to it. But it's challenging because this wasn't necessarily written for that purpose. That being said, there are arguments laid out that one of the foundations of Midrash was probably the preaching in the ancient synagogue. So around the time of Jesus, there is this question of, right, we have in part the historical evidence for this is from the New Testament, is that we have stories of Jesus, right, going and preaching, right, all over the Galilee and so on and so forth. And so we know that there were rabbis, right, doing this, and what was the content of what they were doing? Well, some of them we have from the New Testament, and presumably we have vestiges of them in the Midrash, that these are textual elaborations. There's disagreement on whether or not that's historically accurate or not, and to what extent it is, but there is a notion that, like, actually some of this may have been based on the preaching in the ancient synagogue. Sure. Other question?
Just for everybody here, I think it would be, keep this in the back of your mind. If you have questions like this and you want some additional answers or to find out more information, I'm sure that Laron would be happy to answer anything that you'd have here at the Lux Center at the seminary, or Rabbi himself. You'd be happy to contact him. It's interesting because as I listen to some of the stories from the Midrash, how often do you use a story in your homily? All the time. You always use something. And most of the time, we do pretty much what Jesus did from the parabolic standpoint. We're using stories that it happened to us at work, at the tool and die company, at the construction site, in a classroom, whatever it might be. We're using stories that other people can understand. And here we have the rabbis using this perhaps at a higher intellect, but same kind of thing. So I find it fascinating. I'm going to do a little research myself. I think Kathy Hardy has taken some notes here. We might have some new literature in the library. We'll see how that works out. But thank you.
Anybody else?
So just to comment on that, you can see this picture it's a piece of Islamic art, but it's from a famous midrash that obviously made its way into Muslim theology as well, of Abraham smashing his father's idols. And this is a classic example of a midrash because exactly what you said, it's taught so much that kids think it's actually in the Torah, right? That like it is this parable that like the story is that Abraham smashes the all of the idols in his father's house, and then except for the biggest one, and puts the hammer in the hand of the biggest idol, and his father can't be upset with him because he says, oh, the idol did it, right? And showing the absurdity of idolatry, right? Like, you're really going to not punish your kid? Obviously, your kid smashed the idols, not this statue. Statues can't smash things, so how can they also create the world and have any power and potency in general? But these stories they get stuck in the head to the point where that kids will remember that story as if it was one of the biblical stories, right? They get these things mixed up. Well, I want to thank you so much for everything. I think I'm turning it back over to Deacon Steve.
Just finish up, but we had Rabbi Josh was here last year, and Dr. Newberry, raise your hand over there, she's hiding in the corner. Dr. Newberry teaches New Testament, and Dr. Newberry, Rabbi Josh, Laron, and myself had a conversation with some of our students about preaching the Gospel of John without an anti-Judaistic bias. And if you go through the Gospel of John over and over and over again, you hear the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. Well, what does that really mean, and who are they addressing, and what's going on? We had a fantastic discussion that day. So hopefully we can do that again, and I'll offer this to Deacon Dale. Maybe we can do something like that for continuing education for our men here. And of course, anybody would be welcome to that. We can put something out. Maybe we can have that conversation together. That'd be awesome. All right. Thank you, Josh.